Today we're going to talk a little bit about the unique challenges that face medical device molders. Primary topics we'll discuss validation process, transfer of molds between machines, transfer of validated processes between machines, being able to identify whether your processes are running to the validated setup, and also making sure you have data to prove everything you do, and maybe more importantly, data for traceability purposes. First of all, validation is a major headache. Time, resources, machine resources, material, there's just tremendous cost associated with it, and it's a fairly complex process to have to deal with. And then once we've validated that process, very often it's expected that the entire OQ and PQ of the validation process has to be redone when you transfer that mold from one machine to another. And I go through this complex set of instructions to validate my process, very rigid, structured outline, all these documented steps, and I'm still making bad parts. When we run into those quality issues during the OQ phase of the validation, we often make adjustments to the process to improve those quality characteristics, and then we adjust again and we adjust again, and we tend to over-validate. We tend to be doing things during the OQ phase with process development that are addressing issues that should have been addressed up front during the IQ, so that you have the design characteristics necessary and required for thermoplastics. But does it really have to be this hard? RJG's second largest market segment is medical device, and so we've got quite a few customers that are currently doing this work, and they tend to have a different perspective on medical device, and specifically how they apply scientific molding to the work that they do. If you build a good process and you have a capable mold, and you've done your homework up front in the design phase, the validation doesn't really have to be that hard. Use systematic molding methodology through that entire phase. And then when we're using the EDART system, or any data acquisition system, we're having a reference, a data-based approach to what we're doing. We can be more effective during that process. We can identify when things change. We use the data to transfer the process between machines, and so forth. A lot of times, if a custom molder is molding for 2 or 3 different suppliers, 2 or 3 different customers that are different medical OEMs, those medical device manufacturers have specified the validation protocol to the custom molder. You have 3 different customers, you have 3 different validation protocols that you have to try to manage and keep track of. But what we hear from some of our customers is that they develop their own validation protocol and are able to be effective in convincing their customers that those validation protocols will work, and the customers will buy into that concept. We look a little bit at the expectations of the FDA and all of these regulations. Hopefully we can get an understanding in that process of what those expectations are. However, you start opening the book of regulations, and it's quite complex and difficult to understand. RJG is in a unique position because we've got some people that we work with as strategic partners. One of them did a presentation yesterday from the Raincross Group. That company helps custom molders as well as medical device understand and deal with FDA regulations. So we've done our own inquiry with some of these strategic partners, and what it boils down to, the FDA expectations, is that you have a good reason for everything you do, that your process is documented, that you've established a process based on scientific principles. You can support the decisions you make with data. And most importantly, as you're developing the validation protocol, to develop that protocol that is appropriate to the parts you're molding. So the complexity of that validation needs to be different, or your opportunity is for it to be more simple if you're doing a bed pan versus a heart catheter. So make sure that the complexity of the protocol is appropriate to the risk of the part you're molding. If you're already doing medical, you're familiar with the IQ, OQ, PQ. Make sure we're putting things together right in the design phase. This is an area where a lot of problems are evolved from, because when we don't design correct for plastic parts, then we start to do process development in the OQ phase. We're having to tweak the process to correct for what we should have addressed right up front during the design phase. All the FDA really wants, the process should make good parts from any machine, and the process should assure that only good parts are sent to the customer. So in this presentation, I'm going to deal with 4 primary topics, and we'll start talking a little bit about validation using scientific molding. How many people in the audience are familiar with scientific molding? Got some background with that? Okay, so for those of you who have already seen the 4 plastics variables, it's the foundation of scientific molding, understanding the part you're making from the plastics point of view. Plastics temperature, plastics flow, plastic pressure, and plastic cooling. When you change the perspective on the process development to focusing on these areas, shifting away from machine-dependent variables to plastic-dependent variables, you have a much more efficient and effective process. And we also work with the terminology referred to as decoupled molding, so that we're looking at the primary phases of the process, the filling phase, the pressurization phase, and the cooling phase, distinctly as independent phases of the process. By breaking them down and isolating them, we have a more systematic approach for troubleshooting and process development. So we're going to go through this checklist of items in some level of detail for the next couple minutes. The IQ phase is intended use design. Design includes the runner design, the machine selection. Then we go into process development, and then the confirmation phase during the production qualification. Again, in the design phase, we need to understand the risk associated with the part we're molding, and make sure that we're developing the protocol appropriate to that risk. I'm not going to go through these lists in detail, but in the design phase, critical to thermoplastic part design, we need to understand a few important things. For example, wall thicknesses, radiused corners, ribs that will have tendency to sink, those type of things. We need to address the design appropriately. Again, important in this phase to do the right things so that during the operational qualification we're not developing a process around bad design. We look at runner systems. We need to make sure that we're addressing balanced issues, that we have our decision is appropriate on whether we need a hot runner or a cold runner. Are we doing family tooling, which would open up a whole additional slew of design issues? Consider gate type. One example, in runner balance, we need to make sure that we have a balanced design. The design on the left is inherently imbalanced configuration. We don't want to have to process around that later on. So balance is key and critical step of this IQ phase. Press selection. Here's another example, a very critical phase of the IQ, making sure that we have the shot capacity we need, that we have the pressure we need, understanding the machine's capability for speed linearity.